A man walks into a convenience store during a Christmas visit home to buy whipping cream for Irish coffee. Inside, he sees a woman he once loved. They talk about the lives they built after they separated. Years later, that meeting becomes Same Old Lang Syne, a song that returns to radio every December. His biggest single reaches number 2. His albums go platinum again and again. During the success of The Innocent Age, he performs before some of the largest audiences of his career. Then, leader of the band, his tribute to his father reaches number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. But critics grow harsher. The radio eventually moves on. Then advanced prostate cancer ends his life at just 56. The chart positions are real. The Christmas encounter is real. The diagnosis is real. And the Maine waters described in The Reach are real. At the center of it all was a boy raised by serious musicians. His mother was classically trained. His father was a respected band director who spent his life teaching other people how music should sound. The question was never whether Dan belonged in music. It was whether the popular songs he wrote would be treated with the same respect as the formal musical world that shaped him. This is the real story of Dan Fogelberg. Stay until the end. Because the strangest part of his story is not the Christmas meeting, the platinum records, the father he immortalized, or the illness that took him. It is where his story returned after he was gone. Chapter 1. The Leader Before the Song. Daniel Grayling Fogelberg was born on August 13, 1951, in Peoria, Illinois, into a home where music was never merely background sound. It was part of the family's daily life. His mother, Margaret Fogelberg, was a classically trained pianist and singer. His father, Lawrence Fogelberg, worked as a band director, arranger, teacher, and conductor. Lawrence spent decades leading school bands and training young musicians. He treated music as work that demanded preparation, patience, and discipline. Dan grew up watching that seriousness at close range. There was no dramatic fight over whether he should become a musician. His parents did not force him toward one narrow path. Instead, they exposed him to many kinds of music and allowed him to decide what kind of artist he wanted to become. When Dan was 10, his grandfather gave him an acoustic guitar. He bought a chord book, listened closely to records, and began teaching himself how to play. Guitar soon joined piano as another way for him to understand harmony and melody. The records mattered as much as the formal training around him. The Beatles showed him how immediate a popular song could sound. Folk rock introduced him to storytelling, layered harmony, and atmosphere. Classical music stayed in his ear, even before he understood how deeply it was shaping him. By his early teens, Dan was already playing in local groups. First came the Clan, which began by covering Beatles songs. Later, he joined the Coachmen, a group drawn toward the folk rock sound of the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, Gene Clark, Stephen Stills, and Neil Young. In 1967, the Coachmen released a single containing 2 songs written by Dan, Maybe Time Will Let Me Forget, and Don't Want to Lose Her. He was still a teenager. The record did not create a national breakthrough, but it marked a real change. Dan was no longer only learning songs written by other people. He was beginning to build his own catalog. One often repeated account says he conducted the Bradley University Band when he was about 14, although the precise date and circumstances remain unclear. Dan graduated from Woodruff High School in 1969 and enrolled at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He first studied theater, then moved toward painting and visual art. That interest never disappeared. Even after music became his career, he continued painting and remained involved in the visual presentation of his work. Still, music kept pulling him forward. By the time he reached college, Dan had already written songs, recorded a local single, performed in bands, and learned how to build music from several traditions at once. The next step would come in a small coffee house, where a young manager heard enough to place a bet on him. Chapter 2. The Coffee House and Irving Azoff. At the University of Illinois, Dan began performing alone at the Red Herring, a coffee house in Champaign connected to the local folk scene. There was no backing band to carry the performance. He had a guitar, a voice, and a growing collection of original songs. Club owner Peter Burkow encouraged Dan to keep performing there. Through those solo appearances, he learned to depend on the melody, the lyric, and the strength of the performance itself. Nothing else could hide a weak song. During this period, Dan came to the attention of Irving Azoff, another University of Illinois alumnus who was beginning to build a career in music management. Azoff already had connections to REO Speedwagon, but the larger part of his career still lay ahead. A widely repeated story says Azoff first saw Dan playing acoustic guitar at a noisy fraternity event, while much of the crowd ignored him. The exact date and location remain unclear, but the result is certain. Azoff believed Dan had something worth developing. He began managing him and helped move him beyond the college coffeehouse circuit. Dan left school before graduating and started working between Los Angeles and Nashville as his professional career developed. In 1971, Dan opened several concerts for Van Morrison. That connection later grew into a persistent myth that he had performed as a member of Morrison's band. He had not. Dan later explained that he opened those shows alone with his guitar. He admired Morrison, but he was never one of his sidemen. Interest from record companies gradually followed. A&M Records showed interest. So did Asylum Records, where David Geffen was building a major singer-songwriter roster. Dan ultimately signed with Columbia Records, then led by Clive Davis. The contract gave him the chance to make a full album, but it did not guarantee an audience. His debut, Home Free, was recorded in Nashville with producer Norbert Putnam and released in 1972. The record introduced Dan's voice, songwriting, and emotional style, but it produced no major hit. The response was quiet. Dan now had a manager, a major label agreement, and a completed album. He had opened for Van Morrison and drawn attention from powerful figures in the record business. None of it had produced the breakthrough he needed. The next change came when another musician from the Midwest heard possibilities in Dan's songs that the first album had not fully captured. That musician was Joe Walsh. Chapter 3. Joe Walsh and the First Breakthrough. By the time Joe Walsh entered Dan Fogelberg's career, he already understood how to make a record feel larger without burying the song underneath it. Dan needed exactly that. His writing was intimate, but intimate material could disappear when the production lacked force. Walsh knew how to add electric weight and movement while protecting the emotional center of the music. He produced Dan's second album, Souvenirs, released in 1974. The difference was immediate. Walsh contributed guitar and helped widen Dan's acoustic foundation into a fuller folk rock sound. The arrangements carried more power. The choruses opened up. The songs remained personal, but the recordings now had greater reach. Then came Part of the Plan. In 1975, the song reached number 31 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 22 on the Adult Contemporary chart. It was not a #1 record, but it was Dan's first national hit. Souvenirs climbed to number 17 on the album chart and later earned double platinum certification. After years of coffeehouses, opening slots, demos, and uncertain label interest, Dan had finally broken through. The album also made his musical identity easier to hear. Acoustic guitar, layered harmonies, piano, rock instrumentation, and carefully arranged studio detail all worked together. The writing was direct without being plain, and emotional without relying on vocal theatrics. Listeners responded. Some critics were less generous. As Dan's popularity grew, parts of the press treated his emotional directness as sentimentality. That criticism would follow him even as his records sold in greater numbers. Dan did not answer by pulling back. He went deeper into the studio. Released in 1975, Captured Angel showed how much control he could take over a recording. Dan performed much of the instrumental and vocal material himself, assembling songs one layer at a time. 2 years later, Netherlands widened the scale again. The 1977 album reached number 13 and eventually became double platinum. Its colder, more atmospheric sound reflected the Rocky Mountain settings that had begun influencing Dan's imagination. By then, he had become more than a singer carrying an acoustic guitar. He was also a producer, arranger, and multi-instrumentalist, with a musical world listeners could recognize as his own. In 1978, Dan joined flutist Tim Weisberg for Twin Sons of Different Mothers. The collaboration reached number 8 and produced The Power of Gold, one of their best-known recordings. Then came Phoenix in 1979. The album reached number 3 and became another double platinum success. Its biggest single, Longer, climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March of 1980 and reached number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. That was the commercial peak of Dan's singles career. He had moved from a small Illinois coffeehouse to the upper reaches of American radio. His songs were now reaching people far beyond the rooms where he had first performed them. Yet the album that would define him most was still ahead. Its doorway was an old relationship, a Christmas visit, and an unexpected meeting in a convenience store. Chapter 4. The Innocent Age. The meeting behind Same Old Lang Syne happened during a Christmas visit to Peoria in either 1975 or 1976. Dan went to a convenience store to buy whipping cream for Irish coffee. Inside, he unexpectedly found a former high school girlfriend. They had once been close. Now they stood beneath fluorescent lights, talking about the separate lives they had built after the relationship ended. The moment was ordinary, awkward, and painfully adult. Dan turned it into a song. He wrote Same Old Lang Syne before he knew exactly where it belonged. The opening carried some humor, but the story widened as it continued. A chance reunion became a song about time, memory, and the distance between youth and adult life. For years, Dan held it back. By New Year's Eve of 1980, he was arranging the songs for a new album. Same Old Lang Syne was already attracting attention, and the record company wanted the project completed. Dan listened to the sequence and decided it was not finished. He told Irving Azoff he needed more time. That was not a small request. A completed album meant a release date, promotion, touring, and income. Dan was asking everyone to stop after the machinery had already begun moving. Azoff supported him. Dan returned to the studio and expanded the project into a double album. The additional work produced material including Ghosts and The Reach. The result was The Innocent Age, released in 1981. It became the largest and most ambitious statement of his career. Across the double album, Dan traced the movement from childhood toward age, passing through family, love, memory, mortality, and the losses that begin long before death. The guests showed how far he had come. Joni Mitchell, Emmylou Harris, and Chris Hillman all appeared on the record, connecting Dan to the folk, country, and California rock traditions that had shaped his writing. Then, the major singles arrived. Hard to Say, Run for the Roses, The Same Old Lang Syne, and Leader of the Band.
But why each time the sky begins to snow on warm morning eves, with my food was totaled up and bad, thundering velvet hands, his gen.
That final song reached further back than the others, because it returned Dan to the home where his story had started. Lawrence Fogelberg had spent decades leading school bands, arranging music, and teaching young musicians how to listen. Dan wrote Leader of the Band as a direct tribute to that life. In 1982, the song reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. More importantly, Lawrence heard it. His father lived long enough to hear their family story placed on national radio. Dan did not have to write the tribute after the funeral or wonder whether the words had come too late. Lawrence died in 1982, during the same period when Leader of the Band became inseparable from Dan's name. Another moment carried similar weight. Dan performed at Carnegie Hall with both parents present. Years earlier, Lawrence had visited that same building to hear Arturo Toscanini conduct. Now he sat inside it while his own son stood on stage. Dan had chosen records and popular songwriting, but Lawrence was watching him perform in one of music's most respected halls. That scene answered the question Dan had carried from childhood better than any award could have done. The Innocent Age rose to number 6, and later earned double platinum certification. The touring period around it became the commercial peak of Dan's career, bringing him some of the largest audiences he ever faced. He had delayed the album when the company wanted it finished. The delay helped produce the defining commercial record of his career. Chapter 5. Beyond the Formula. In 1982, Columbia released Greatest Hits. The collection reached number 15 and eventually became triple platinum. It also contained 2 new songs, Missing You
Ooh, I'm missing you.
and Make Love Stay.
How do we make love stay?
Both became hits. Dan now had every reason to keep repeating the sound that had carried him through Phoenix and The Innocent Age. Instead, his work continued to move. Released in 1984, Windows and Walls turned toward darker stories and more observational writing.
Windows and walls.
Dan began writing more often about characters, distance, age, and lives marked by disappointment. The album still reached number 15 and earned gold certification, but the critical response grew harsher. His chart performance also began to decline. Rather than rebuild his largest soft rock hits, Dan followed his interest in bluegrass and acoustic music. High Country Snows, released in 1985,
And the high country snow.
grew from his connection to the musical culture around the Telluride Bluegrass Festival. The record emphasized ensemble playing, acoustic instruments, and traditional forms. It reached number 30 on the Maine album chart, number 23 on the country chart, and earned gold certification. The project showed how far Dan's interests extended beyond the soft rock label attached to him. That label also fed another long-running story. Dan's name had been discussed during a period when the Eagles were reorganizing. Over time, that fact turned into a claim that he had been formally invited to join the band. He had not. Dan later explained that he discussed the idea with Don Henley, and both men recognized that their artistic directions did not fit. He joked that Joe Walsh eventually got the job, although the actual sequence was more complicated. The larger point was simple. Dan knew what kind of work he wanted to make. Later albums included Exiles, The Wild Places, and River of Souls. In 1995, he reunited with Tim Weisberg for No Resemblance Whatsoever. The chart positions fell, and mainstream radio attention faded. Dan kept recording. He kept touring. He kept painting and performing acoustic shows for the listeners who remained with him. Classical music also stayed central to his private listening. By the late 1990s, Dan said most of the music he listened to was classical, with Mozart among his favorite composers. That habit reflected the range of his musical interests. Arrangement, structure, and atmosphere mattered to him as much as a hit single. In 2003, he released Full Circle. It would become the final studio album issued during his lifetime. The following year, the meaning of every song he had written about age and time began to change. Chapter 6. The Reach. Dan was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer in the late spring or early summer of 2004. Some accounts place the diagnosis in May. The official family account gives June. Either way, the disease was already advanced. Treatment followed, and in August of 2005, Dan announced that the cancer had entered partial remission. He also urged men, especially those over 50, to speak with their doctors about prostate screening. For a time, treatment produced partial remission. Then the cancer returned. There is no need to invent final words, a bedside confession, or a dramatic farewell. The documented facts are enough. December 16, 2007. Deer Isle, Maine. Dan Fogelberg dies at home. He is 56. The reported cause is complications from advanced prostate cancer. No credible dispute surrounds that finding. Dan had spent much of his life writing about memory, age, distance, and the places people carry inside themselves. Now his own life had ended at 56. He was cremated. His ashes were reportedly scattered over Eggemogan Reach, the stretch of Maine water he had already placed inside the Reach. The connection should not be treated as prophecy. There is no evidence that Dan wrote the song as a plan for his own death. The truth is quieter than that. He loved the place enough to write about it while he was alive. After his death, it became part of his final story. the music continued. The posthumous album Love in Time appeared in 2009 and reached number 117 on the album chart. A memorial garden opened in Peoria Riverfront Park in 2010. Part of Abington Street was renamed Fogelberg Parkway, honoring both Dan and his father. The road passes Woodruff High School and approaches the area connected with the convenience store meeting behind same Old Lang Syne. In 2017, Dan entered the Colorado Music Hall of Fame on what would have been his 66th birthday. That year also brought Dan Fogelberg, live at Carnegie Hall, and a tribute to Dan Fogelberg. The tribute included artists such as Garth Brooks, Vince Gill, Michael McDonald, Jimmy Buffett, and the Eagles with Joe Walsh. The induction concert also raised money for the Prostate Cancer Foundation. Every December, Same Old Lang Syne returns to the radio. Listeners hear a convenience store, an old relationship, and a conversation shaped by time. Most never knew the people inside the story. They understood the feeling. That was Dan's gift. He could take an ordinary memory and give it enough melody to outlive the people who lived it. In the end, Dan Fogelberg's greatest proof was not a chart position, a platinum album, or a sold-out hall. It was leader of the band. He wrote the song while his father was still alive, which meant Lawrence Fogelberg heard the tribute before it became part of Dan's legacy. That mattered. Same Old Lang Syne preserved a chance meeting. Leader of the band preserved a father. And
the leader of the band is touch in his eyes.
The Reach preserved a place. After Dan died, his ashes were reportedly scattered over the Maine waters he had already placed inside that song. The story came full circle, not through myth, but through memory. If stories like this still matter to you, subscribe for more real music history. Dan Fogelberg was more than a soft rock voice from another decade. He understood that ordinary moments often become important only after they are gone. A winter conversation, a father's music, a quiet stretch of water. He turned all three into songs, and the songs remained.